that have never been seen before. We're very, very fortunate in our new location that opened up to the public on May 1st, in that we've more than tripled the space of our prior location on Madison Avenue. Our fifth floor gallery is the largest open space gallery of any museum in the world, and we're very glad that the first major exhibit from Frank Stella is over there right now, a couple floors down from here. The architect of our building is, as many of you know, Renzo Piano. This is his approximate 23rd museum that he's been the architect. And when you approach the building and you look at it, you kind of say, looks kind of industrial, right? Maybe if you're coming, up or down Washington Street, you see the top floor, the 8th floor, and it's a certain size, and then the 7th floor gets a little bit bigger, and so on and so on. There's terraces outside, and there's water towers. It looks that way because what Piano really was looking for is something that really steps into the city. It's matching the area geographically, but this area, as we'll speak about a little bit during the tour, is also talking about the art, because the original location of the Whitney collection was on 8th Street, right near here. In fact, 101, 102 years ago, Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney, our founder, took a couple of her townhouses and made it the Whitney Studio, a studio club. So we want to talk about the art over here. Now, when we talk about our collection over here, the Whitney collection, there are about 5 or 6 themes or chapters. They are not all in sequence, but each theme or chapter, this one named Circus, each theme is named after a specific work of art. And we'll talk about many of those works, including Kyle the Circus, in a minute. But I have a very important question to ask you. Now, nobody wants homework on a Saturday. That's true, right? Okay. Do you want homework? Not really. You want to go trick-or-treating, yes? Okay. Well, there's all treats today, no tricks at the Whitney. So here is your question, and it's a foolish one. How many of you use Facebook? Okay. Or Twitter? Or you at least text? All right? And what we're doing here is we're talking about how we connect to people. How do we find them? What's important? What's important about us? We're asked to go on Facebook and say we like something, or we're following somebody on Twitter. Well, that connects to where we are right now, because this area, this theme called the Circus, is talking about 80 or 90 years ago, and to some degree, more of an urban setting. How did people find each other? What did they like? Where did they go? Who did they follow? What was exciting? Now, the collection over here on the 7th floor is not just about urban areas such as New York or Philadelphia or Miami or Montreal. It's also about how art is seen by others and how we got to the point of this collection. So let's go to the Circus. We're right here. And here's a thought as we look at this absolutely fantastic creative work from Alexander Calder, known as Sir Calder or Calder Circus. And it's another question. You're saying, oh, more homework, more questions? Why is he doing this on Halloween? Well, it's all treats today. How would you like to take 5 years of your life and do whatever you want? How's that sound?
Great.
Pretty good. How about you? Are you in the middle of the 5-year plan? Yes. Are you in the middle of the 5-year plan? Not yet. Okay, but he's got a cool camera. All right, so that's what Calder did. He took 5 years starting in 1926, went to Paris, and almost his entire time he did this. He built this piece by piece, item by item. And in a lot of ways, we may look at this and say, this is such creative art. It really goes way beyond the idea of art. It is a show. It is a performance. For over 30 years, Calder carried around 2, sometimes more, brown or maroon suitcases, heavy suitcases, opened them up and constructed these on each performance. He went town to town, city to city, living rooms, all over North America and Europe, and performed this with his own hands. When you see these components, he collected these because it's not something that he went to a store. There was no Home Depot in the 1920s. These are all found parts: wire, rope, canvas, tops of a mop, cardboard. Everything you see here is found items. When we think about artists that are environmentally looking to collect items and produce it as a piece of art, he was doing this 90 years ago. How did he decide on this? He attended Ringling Brothers and Barnum and Bailey Circus every day for about 2 weeks, and he sketched. He's trained as a mechanical engineer. He then made a decision on 20 specific acts And that's what we see here. And this is only a portion of it. So when we talk about circus acts, high wire acts, belly dancers, lion tamers, flaming items coming through the mouth of clowns, clowns smoking, jumping rope. What kind of sense of humor did this great man have? Let's focus for a second on this lion that's part of a lion taming act. Oh, and by the way, like everything else, it's on YouTube. If you go on YouTube and you put in Calder's Circus, you will see versions of him filmed, including there's a 4-minute or so clip behind me as well, and some wonderful performances. In fact, that clip is from one of his last. It's in color. It's 1961. It's part of a 45-minute performance. So he opens his suitcases, he builds these items, and again, a sense of humor of this wonderful artist, lion taming act. Well, the lion rises up, lion goes down. Sense of humor, the lion leaves something behind. We won't say what that is exactly. This is a family museum. See that shovel over there? A clown comes by in the video and cleans up what's behind that the lion left as a little prize or surprise. So he did all this in terms of a show, in terms of a performance. Starting in 1931, he moved away from this and started to build something called mobiles, which was the idea of kinesthetics and movement, so that it was really based upon a name from his close friend Marcel Duchamp. When we think about ready-mades, we think about these objects. It was Duchamp that gave him the name to use called mobiles. So if you want to have fun, we need to go to the circus. It's like Big Apple Circus is opening soon in Lincoln Center. But you want to have a good time, who's ready to dance? Ready to dance? Maybe. Maybe. Ready to dance? I got a yes. All right, come on over here. We're going to dance. So this area is called the circus, and when we talk about having a good time, this is 1933. Now, if you want to dance with one of these folks, these ladies, and I'm going to be using terms that was used by the artist and by the time that this was used in the 1930s, if you want to dance with this lady with the beautiful pink dress over here who's sitting down on the ledge on the veranda, you may want to dance with her a few minutes and then somebody else, but it's going to cost you, all right? It's not free. Anybody know the cost of this?
10 cents.
It's 10 cents. It's 10 cents a dance. That's the name of this wonderful work from Reginald Marsh from 1933. Reginald Marsh was an artist who was educated at Yale University. But because of his close friendship with some of the most educated and well-to-do folks, they embraced his art, they purchased it, and made it something important. Now, I should tell you that art like this around the 1920s and 30s was basically despised. So much so that when we think of when the collection was started over here, Mrs. Whitney had her townhouses on 8th Street, about 8 blocks from here, and she had something called the Whitney Studio, then Studio Club. And about 400 artists belonged to it that Mrs. Whitney generously provided space to work in, classes, trips to Europe so artists could refine their art. She then had a waiting list by 1928 of about 400 other artists that wanted to join her. She decided to take about 400 or 500 of almost all her works of art, and she offered it at no cost to the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Nice deal, right? What did the management of the Metropolitan Museum say about that offer? No, thank you. Because the art that we're talking about that was similar to this was untested, not loved, and it often featured the everyday individual or new American having a good time in their workplace, in the subway, in a club. Yes, there were clubs 90 years ago, and having a good time. In fact, around that time, some of the art we speak about here was described by some of the critics as part of what was called the ash can school. An ash can wasn't an exact school that you went to a building. It was art that was ascribed to American art. So when we talk about ash can school, it was said that art like this belonged in the garbage. It was really disliked. That drove Mrs. Whitney to start the Whitney Museum, again on 8th Street over here nearby. So when we look at this art over here, and I apologize, and we think about going for a dance, this feature over here, individual, this figure, is the idea in the 1930s, God bless you, is the idea in the 1930s of the blonde bombshell. That's what it was called. In fact, you want some entertainment? You went to a live stage show called Burlesque, which is back now, especially in Williamsburg and elsewhere, right? And also, as part of the show that you went to over here, you might dance with this lady for 10 cents a dance. It would last 5 minutes. Do you want to dance with her again? Yes? It's going to cost you another 10 cents. This is not free. These dances were referred to at the time as taxi dances. Some of you heard of that before, which kind of is like maybe in 2015 you call your Uber cab and you have it to come over to you, right? You dance for 5 minutes, you stop, you select another lady and you dance. Now in this type of style, he is really showing people having a good time in a club, but in 1933, it was the last year of Prohibition. What was being prohibited? Alcohol, right? So, some of these clubs were legal, some were not, and if you wanted to have a drink in some of these clubs or go dance, you maybe went through a back alleyway, you went through the back of the store that sold some candy, and you had to give a knock or a secret word, and they were called speakeasies. That's the only way you got in. So if you want to have a good time, we'd have to go for a dance, but you want to have a really good time, who wants to go to a fight? A fight at the Whitney? Don't leave us. I saw you dancing. It was 10 cents a dance. Plenty of room. Love that outfit. Very cool. Come on in. This was a championship fight of the world in the Polo Grounds about 4 miles north of here, around 157th Street, and it was Jack Dempsey. And Dempsey was known as not the nicest, cleanest of fighters, but he usually won his bouts. So this actual fight was 1923, and we know the end of this fight. It was over in less than 2 full rounds. It was broadcast on the radio, and guess what? It was filmed, and it's on YouTube. So there's a 4-minute entire fight on YouTube. We know Dempsey won the fight, and this is not a spoiler like the final episode of Mad Men after 7 years. All right, so Dempsey really looks great because he won, and he is right standing above and knocks out the challenger, and that's it. The name of this work is Dempsey and Furbo from 1924 from George Bellows. This painting almost never happened because Bellows, an illustrator from Philadelphia, was hired to do some sketches for the New York Daily Mirror and I think the New York Daily News, and then all the newspapers went out on strike. He then used those sketches and produced this classic work of art. Now, Bellows was known to have these types of paintings showing the action, the activity, the events in New York. Prize fights, but also scenes of the Hudson River, like right near here. But in this particular situation, he is showing the true one moment. This is not made up. In round 1, where Louise Furbo knocks Dempsey through the ropes and down on these gentlemen over here. Now, why does he show this? Here's a hint. We look at these people over here who are, some of them spectators like us, others are reporters. What do we notice if we look at this gentleman in the middle? What's that hand doing?
Catching him.
He's pushing him back in the ring. It wasn't the fairest of fights. In fact, we know that at the end of round 1, when the bell rang, and you would see this on YouTube, Dempsey approaches Louis Furbo and continues to pummel him. And it's questionable if the referee really stops him. So, he so knocks him out and so out of it, Furbo, that by the time the second round begins, it's over real quickly. Now, how do we know Bellows is in the painting? That's him. He puts himself often in these works over here. And the use of geometry is important in this work because within a couple of years after this painting, and we'll see some works of this in a couple of galleries from now, it's a method and a technique called precisionism. Strong lines and also tied to everything that's all American. The strength of America, its might, its progress, its success, especially in the 1920s before the stock market crashes in 29. Some say the use of the lines and diagonals over here are something that he called dynamic symmetry, but it's a strong use also of rectangles as well. Some have counted the rectangles and they say there's at least 5 of them. Now, When we know this fight was over so quickly by the end of the second round, it is said that later on, when Dempsey became a restaurant owner and very, very promising man, he offered in a quiet meeting many years later a bag of cash to Louise Furbo. Maybe it was guilt, maybe not. But this was at the time in 1923, and sadly Bellows passed away about a year after this work was over. Mrs. Whitney wanted this work for the opening of the Whitney Museum in 1931. It was offered by Bellows' widow for $25,000. Eventually, Mrs. Whitney paid $18,000 for it. Still not bad. Well, what's iconic also about this is that every iteration of the Whitney Museum, every building that's open, from the first time on 8th Street to the move up to 54th Street, Madison Avenue to here, this work always appears at the opening of each building. It is so important to the collection and so important for the dynamics of New York. But if you want to have a good time, we're going to head, over now to Riverside Drive, and we're going to see some sailors and floozy. Come on over, there's room. I just want to let our guests see this, so don't leave me. Join me. Pardon me, madam, I just want to stand over here next to the work, but don't leave me. No, we want you right there. Now, we are on Riverside Drive. We've gone a little bit downtown from the Polo Grounds, and this is actually, really, 87th Street, Riverside Drive, about a few miles north of here, and it's called Sailors and Soldiers Monument, a Sailors or Soldiers and Sailors Monument. Well, it doesn't look like this, but it is still there, and it is quite beautiful. It is quite restful. It looks out on the Hudson River, but this has been a very interesting time. This is over here a time in 1938, and the work is called Sailors and Floozies. Now, we know what a sailor is. I have to ask you, again, Family Museum, what's a floozy? Anybody? A loose woman, he said. Homeless person. Well, he said loose woman, I didn't, but that's one way of describing it. This has been a rather amazing night. We see three sailors here, but there's actually another one over here, and he's kind of out of it. It's about sunrise. It's been a very, very interesting night, and Paul Cadmus, in doing this work, it's a series of three, and this generated such hot publicity, this and another work of the series of three. Let's look at the work and talk about this. This character, this figure over here in the ground, who's totally out of it, he has a bottle over here. There's still a little bit left. He gives a vision of a Renaissance painting like the male sleeping Venus. But the women are clearly in charge. And we see that she is standing over him, and she has her arms underneath his armpits. He has one hand resting at the top, his right hand on his crotch, and over here the same story. The men are really out of it. But then it's the question of how Cadmus portrays the men and the women. He's a man who is gay and could not come out at the time, but the women look a little bit different. She has the look of somebody that's a little more masculine. We see her over here, and look at her hat. Her hat is in the shape of a phallic symbol. So the women are in charge over here in a lot of ways, but this is a very difficult time in America. It's 1938. Europe is raging at war. America is trying to provide some supplies and funding for it. But there's always a sense of reality in Cadmus's paintings. On the bottom left is an actual headline, from the New York Daily News in 1938. And it says approximately 3,000 killed in air raid. Picture of Mussolini on the cover. So this is what these sailors were facing at the time after a night of carousing and debauchery. Well, we also know another sense of reality because this work and another work in the series was banned. Another one from the series, called The Fleet's Inn, and two of the three are part of our collection, was about to be shown in the Corcoran Gallery in Washington, D.C. Corcoran used to be a wonderful museum. Well, the Secretary of the Navy was in the area, and the naval leadership was about to visit the museum. They told the Corcoran, do not show the work of art. What did the Corcoran do? Did they show it? No, because they were generating likely some funds from the federal government. This exact work was about to be shown in San Francisco at their exposition in 1940. And again, the Navy said no. The work was shown. In San Francisco, the decision there was that this work must be shown. Cadmus loved it. It provided publicity. It was in the newspapers. 2 out of the 3 in the cycle were banned in the United States. 1 on the East Coast, this one on the West Coast. Here's what he said in reaction to it. A great sense of humor the man had. He said, and I paraphrase, "I think this work is absolutely perfect." He said then, "I will recommend that this be used as a recruitment poster for the Navy." He did say that. Notice something here, the graffiti on the wall, all right? It's all around. I can't read a lot of them to you, but he also feels the work doesn't end on the canvas. It continues as life does beyond it because it's on the frame. This is the original frame. It's his etching, it's his sketches. It's part of chalk marks over here. It's matching some of the description of what we see of the characters in the work as well. So he continues this beyond this. So this has been a rough night. But you know what happened before this? Maybe they went to play poker. You ready to play poker? Are you ready?
Sure.
Oh, let's go. Streetcar named Desire. Now, this is a commissioned work, but when he did this, he was really showing the figures in a very, very seductive way and having a good time. Something like a Marlon Brando figure over here in the middle. I don't know if that was intentional, but one that we know was in fact directed and intentional was Blanche Dubois over here. She was played on Broadway at some point by Jessica Tandy, one of the most important actresses of mid-20th century. Jessica Tandy knew about this work and said to Benton, "Do not show this work of art." She did not want it completed. She did not want it shown because she is shown in a very, very seductive manner over here. Blanche Dubois is looking in the mirror. She's caressing and looking at herself. Sisters looking behind her. So this work obviously became part of our permanent collection as everything on this floor and was shown. What makes this work also very different is 1948. And at that time, American art and art around the world did not look like this. It was going in a totally different direction post-war. It was moving towards abstraction. How you doing? Good. My voice holds up, it's even better. Perfect. Come on in this room. Watch the black line on the floor. No, but please come forward. It'll be just tight here for a couple of minutes. We'll give a moment for our guests, Halloween attire and all, to arrive. Would be nice if we can give out some candy treats, but not in the museum. We couldn't do that. I think our guests are just about in the gallery. Leave a little access space for those to come through. So, we are here in a gallery called New York, New York, 1955. Now, this is not named after the great tune sung by Liza Minnelli and Frank Sinatra, which came, I think, in the 1980s. It's named after the idea of not just a work of art, but also the focus on art and the art world was all in New York. In fact, it was called by the late 40s and into the 50s New York School. It wasn't a physical building, but post-World War II, after 1945, artists were coming here. And also, artists did not want to necessarily portray figures and actions that were directly related to some of the most horrendous things of the 1930s and 40s. They wanted to move beyond the Depression economically. They wanted to move past the dropping of the atomic bombs in 1945, the end of World War II, the liberation of some of the survivors from concentration camps, and they moved towards abstraction. And abstraction was in 2 direct avenues. One was called action or gestural paintings, which we'll talk about a little bit today, and the other was color field or color block painting. Action or gestural painting has to do with the artist pouring her or his mind out on the canvas. It's their moods, their direction, their conscious, their subconscious, how they are pouring it out. We start over here with the few works we'll talk about at our time here with Willem de Kooning's work, Woman and Bicycle, from 1952-1953. In doing this work, he was breaking yet a different mold. There are about 12 works of art in his Woman series. And the initial works that I believe started around 1944 were very nicely named, even though it sounds very sexist, Woman 1, Woman 2, Woman 3, and they are wonderful. This one is truly very different and stands out because it's woman and bicycle, it's action, it's gestures, it's movement, and it's tied to real story and figuration, which is often different than a lot of the abstract works coming from the 1940s and 50s. He did this work at a time that things were rapidly changing in America. 1952, 63 years ago, was about the start of Playboy magazine. And we see changes happening soon with Playboy magazine. But what was shown there? Women that were not necessarily dressed. And around that time, and even going back to the 1940s, we had books called pulp, where women were placed in a very different vein and light or seductively. So here he presents this woman in a way that at the time he did this work, and until 63 years forward, coming after he did this work, some say the woman is presented as very objectionable. Look how he presents her. Kind of like cat's eyes, peering right out at us. The nose is kind of cut into the canvas. And then we have the story of the teeth. How many sets of teeth? 2. For this exact and some similar works, he looked at the 2 sets of teeth, and humorously he said, the second set of teeth, it's a mistake. And then he said, I'll leave it in. I'm going to call it her necklace. So he left that in the work of art over here, bosom coming forward over here, and yes, she's on a bicycle. And on a bicycle, not with pants and not with flats, she has on a yellow dress. We see the wheels off to the side, and there's the heels over here. It's very reminiscent when he came here to America on a ship with his mother. So it's all the action of the time and how women were portrayed. He was asked in an interview in the 1950s about this and similar works of art. And I don't know if many of you will like this answer, but we are very, very honest about what we say about our works. He was asked, in drawing women this way, he was simply said, and I paraphrase, do you like women? And his answer was, I like women as long as they're good looking. Not good to say in 2015 at all. When we think about gestural and action painting, we have Jackson Pollock. This is Pollock's work from 1950. It's number 27, 1950. The year is in the work. Some say, with his works, why the numbers? There's an easy answer to that. He took a 1 to 2 year period and just numbered them in sequence. Now, in so many of his works, they are large scale that they can't be placed on an easel, and they are placed down on the ground. This and other similar works were done in his barn studio way out in Long Island in a little town called Springs. And there is, in fact, a small museum over there with his and his wife, de Kooning, and others' collection there. This little town called Springs is now something we call the Hamptons. So, it's rather upscale and rather expensive now. In those days, it was quiet, it was different, and it was mainly farmland, and it was inexpensive. So when doing this type of work, we look at Pollock and what he is producing on the canvas, and we say, well, there's drips and splatters. What is the story? What is he telling us here? There is a real story, because he felt that he is pouring not just the paint, he is pouring himself, his mind, his emotions, his feeling right on the canvas. He had a procedure that he used in most of his works, especially at the time in the 1950s. He would walk around the canvas, and you can see online, there we go, on YouTube again, all right, maybe not this particular work of how he produced it, and it's fairly similar. He walks around the canvas, he studies the blank canvas. Then what he does, he often walks on the canvas, and he decides to start usually with the blacks and the whites, those paints first. He throws it, splatters it, drips it, pours it, not just with brushes, but with sticks, pouring out paint cans on it. He then does layers and layers of it, depending on his emotion, depending on the period of time, and then after he feels he's completed with the blacks and the whites, he then applies the colors, because that's his mood and emotion at the time. In this particular work, it's the grays, it's the yellows, it's the golds, it's the pinks, it's the beige that he pours on the canvas. Now, talking about Pollock as a wonderful artist, he really broke the mold and such direction of abstraction that it was so much of a direction that the focus here was again on America, and New York School as art featured over here. Also, he was known in the 1950s as a man suffering from alcoholism. So much so that his marriage was breaking up, so around 1952, 1953, his wife, an artist and wonderful Lee Krasner, left him. She came back on and off, but then a terrible event. He died in a horrendous car crash, nothing to do with his alcoholism, in 1956. Lee Krasner, his wife, still grieved greatly. Let's see the result of 1 year of her grieving. I think we're all about here. We may run over a little bit because I want to give time for you, our guests, to enjoy the works and all have forward the time to see the works of art. This is Lee Krasner's work, The Seasons. For a 1 year period, she moved back to their home in Springs after a period of separation when he was really suffering from alcoholism and becoming more out of control. And she virtually went into the studio that they both worked in, and she almost lived there. So for a 1 year period, her time was spent in their studio, which was really a barn in their home out in Springs on Eastern Long Island. And for 1 year, she worked on this. This particular work, completed in 1957, a year after Pollock died in that crash, was the result. And it goes in a different direction, not just in terms of abstraction, but it mixes figuration with her moods, her feelings, and the emotions. Because when we think of the title, The Seasons, it's not just fall turning into winter. It's the seasons of life. It's the change she's going through, a re-examination, and also for her as an artist, coming out of the shadows of where Pollock was really so well featured in the art world. And it was really virtually impossible for a woman to be having her work shown in galleries or museums, especially in the 1950s. The result over here, The Seasons, really shows growth, change, possibilities, and questions. Because there's fruit here, possibly pits, pomegranates, apples. Some look at the center and say, is that the breast of a woman? We see the foliage around it. When she did this work of art, it was so different and so well featured as one of the largest of large-scale works that by the 1960s, at the start of the feminist and women's rights movement, she was embraced so much that she moved forward as an artist in relation to this and similar works, and because of an artist who really was starting to be embraced by museums and the art world. But as we look at this work of art, we think of, how did abstraction begin? Where did it start from? Let's take a look at that in the next gallery. Hey. We'll wait till our guests come in. There's room. Come on, and the Halloween and everything is fine. Give an opportunity to everybody who would like to see the works and arrive. I think we're almost about here. In our last gallery, we spoke about works of abstraction from the 1940s and 50s. We think, where did this come from? Where are the generations at this time that were really moving towards abstraction? Because abstraction really was not something that was new or new to America in the 1940s and 50s. We look at a work like this and see the origins. This is Marsden Hartley's work, Painting Number 5, from 1914-1915. The name of this gallery is called Cocktail. We think of cocktail as a drink, but also it's a serving of not just the works in our collection, but it's also a path that gets split. Because in the early 1900s, the beginning of the 20th century, artists like Hartley, Americans like him, were undecided. Were they going to emulate and be so influenced by great European artists, or were they following their own path? This is the perfect blend, because when one looked at Painting Number 5, which is part of a series called War Motifs, we say, this is pure abstraction. We see the lines, we see the direction, we see the layers, we can imagine the type of expressionism that is going on in here, that the influence is coming from European artists. All true. But what's not here is that there is a coded message, which never jumps out at us right away. The coded message is a story. It's a wonderful brief story called Of Love and Loss, because this is based upon his time in Germany. So he was tied to Alfred Stieglitz, one of the most important photographers of late 19th into the 20th century, the husband of Georgia O'Keeffe, we'll talk about in a few minutes. And also, if you were tied to Alfred Stieglitz, he was a promoter. He had his galleries, such as Gallery 291 on Fifth Avenue, just about 7-8 blocks from here. And if you were tied to his circle of artists, they were called the Stieglitz Circle. And he promoted your art, your works. You became important as a modernist, as an abstractionist. Hartley was part of this. In fact, when Hartley got connected with Stieglitz, a funny short story, he never thought that Stieglitz would give him a chance at an exhibit. So he takes his pocket, turns it inside out, he takes out a nickel, he says, "Here, this is all I have. Now will you produce my works of art in your galleries?" And he did. He gave him a one-person show in 1909. He then helped pay for a trip to go for one of his first important trips to Paris. He hated Paris. He hated it. Who could not like Paris? Well, he then decided, after meeting a gentleman by the name of Karl von Freiberg and his cousin Ronneberg, to go to Germany. Germany he fell in love with. Remember, this is around a very odd time. So he goes to Germany around 1913, 1914, and already the drums of war are starting for World War I. He secretly falls in love with Karl von Freiberg. And for a man at the time, about 102 years ago, to fall in love with another man was unheard of. But he also fell in love with Berlin and Germany because of its pageantry. He loved the idea of people just going out, having a good time, but military soldiers in the street constantly. This is what he favored at the time. Well, von Freiberg was his lover, but von Freiberg died in the very earliest months of World War I in 1914. That's what this work is about. Of the 7 or so items in the War Motif series, this one is likely the most iconic because there is so much symbolism, there's so much coded messaging in here. So when we think of his love for von Freiberg, we see over here at the center there are 2 concentric circles. The German Iron Cross is awarded to a soldier when he's died in battle. The Red Cross over here is supposed to aid. But this work is also a work of odd dichotomies, because while we see the Red Cross, which is supposed to aid and help, there's also the opposite end of the brutality of war. But what's also odd is about his love of Germany at a very strange time when America is fighting against Germany, and he's over there at the start of World War I, but at the same time it's about his secret love. Other things going on here. The chess or checkerboard, von Freiberg, that was his favorite game, playing chess. The blue waves over here, that's the flag of Bavaria, where they met and also stayed much of the time. There's epaulets, there's buttons, there's lines over here. And then we have the number 8 here and somewhat appearing here. That's not the 8th regimental unit that he belonged to, was the 4th. The 8 has to do over here with infinity. You take the number 8, you lay it on your side, it's a sense of forever. But it's also something that he felt very close to. He was close to the idea of Buddhism and Eastern religions. And with Buddhism, the sense of using number 8 is a path to enlightenment. It's a path to infinity and to other beings. The triangle over here tells a story. The triangle is tied to the Father, the Son, the Holy Ghost, the Holy Trinity. But it's also tied to his love of von Freiberg and his meeting von Freiberg's cousin, Ronneberg, that introduced them a few years before. So all these coded messages of the time, here's what the upshot of was this. It's an incredible story. He comes back to America when the war is really getting stronger and stronger in Europe. It's 1916, he comes back here. The war continues to 1918. He shows the work over here to Stieglitz. Stieglitz agrees to show it in his gallery, 291. What do the critics say about this and similar works of art, this one and others? What do they say? No, because it's tied to the time over here that people are thinking America is at war at Germany at the time of the middle of World War I, and how can he produce these works of art? He was so amazed at that reaction at the time that by 1918 he moved more towards representative, figurative work. But what's also different about him at the time, too, is that he really had all the sense of influence from great European artists. Who did he paint with in Germany? And it's very little known. He painted with a man named Kandinsky and Franz Marc. And they were members of a group called the Blau Reiter Group, the Blue Riders. So when we talk about Kandinsky and we talk about Franz Marc and the beautiful use of animals and representation of Eastern religions, he became part of that, and he exhibited with them in Berlin in 1913. When we see this representation of art and how it's presented abstractly, it was a time in New York that amazing things were changing and happening. Let's go see it at the Brooklyn Bridge. This is Joseph, not Frank, Joseph Stella's work, Brooklyn Bridge, a variation on an old theme from 1939. One of the most classic works of art in American art, not just about our museum, but anywhere, because it speaks very much to a changing America and how new people were coming here and what did they see, what did they connect to, how was it important for architecture and art, and what was so important about this bridge. So the Brooklyn Bridge was finished construction, I believe, in 1883. When Stella came here from Italy, and he traveled back and forth, when he first came here when he was about 18 years old, it was 1896, and what does he see pretty much when he lands, probably on Ellis Island? This. He lived for a while on the Lower East Side, again a neighborhood right near the new Whitney Museum, and he walked past this bridge every day. He loved the idea of what this bridge was and represented, so much so that he made multiple paintings of these. At least we think about a dozen or more that was part of his Brooklyn Bridge series, starting in 1918 and going to 1942. This is likely the fifth out of the sixth or so. We think there's six of these paintings. And in doing this work, this one is maybe the most iconic because it tells multiple stories. He loved the idea of European architecture, the great cathedrals, the time of the Renaissance, the embracing of religion. He was very respectful of it, but he saw religion in a different light as part of his respect. In fact, he framed this work with the idea that art, in fact, was changing towards a new religion. So much so that at the time he did this, it was already about a decade or two into a type of thematic direction called futurism. And some of us had heard of that before. Futurism has the idea of speed, emotion, use of geometry, strong lines and direction. But futurism follows really two paths. The politicians and writers who were futurists believed that futurism should be destroy the past, change it radically. The artists like him often felt, take the past, make changes, but build on that past. So this is what he's showing here. The Brooklyn Bridge represented the opening to not just the connection between the city of Brooklyn that became part of the city of New York in 1898, the unification of the boroughs of the city of New York, but really the connection of those Americans and new Americans. So we see the bridge over here in the sweeping cables. And when we see the cables sweep up to the top, it looks like the openings over here are like stained glass windows. Again, the idea of strong use of religious symbolism and some windows that we look through like stained glass. We look through the openings here and we see different buildings. It's hard to say, but that building could be the Empire State Building, which was constructed and completed by 1931. It could be the Chrysler Building from downtown here, or one of the larger buildings a few blocks from here, 40 Wall Street. Hard to say what it is. But we look through here and we see the strong lines, we see the cables, and this cable over here sweeping upward, it is called something known as apotheosis, reaching the pinnacle, reaching the peak, and not just artistically, but in life. What do we reach for? What do we wish to achieve? Look up above, see those lights, whatever. What do you think those represent up there? Stars in heavens above. shining down on America, shining down in this great structure. On the bottom, other types of circular lights or symbols. What might that be? Traffic. Moving towards us, coming towards the viewer. We see over here a view of the skyline of the borough of Manhattan, most likely, and that over here with the lights is sometimes called a predella. The representation in small view over here. Here's what's odd and makes this one different than the others in the series. Look at the reds over here in the openings, pardon me, on the right and the left. That's quite different. While he shows a religious sense or representation and beauty and use of architecture here, he worked for a short time in the 1920s and 30s, going to factories nearby where he lived on the Lower East Side, about a mile from here, but also he went supposedly to factories and coal mines in Pennsylvania. He saw how Americans were living, treated, where they worked for almost nothing. He felt it was a fire, and how they were really so mistreated as new Americans and workers just trying to eke out a living. He looks at this and says this is almost like a living hell. This is the fire that they deal with, while this is showing the beauty at the same time, talking about a dichotomy. So when we look at this work and the sense of beauty in architecture, around the same time in the 1930s, it was America really being worried about anticipation of that Second World War. What's going to happen? Ah, yeah. I almost changed it this morning. We'll give our guests a moment to come in. I think we're all about here. Again, happy Halloween. Thank you for coming to the Whitney. My name is Jan. We're in our last two galleries. If we run over a few minutes, my apologies, but I want to give time for our guests to arrive since it's a busy, nice Saturday over here on Halloween. In our last gallery, we mentioned that the sense of American mood and emotion was really towards anxiety or anticipation. What would be occurring? Now, most of us have been to Brooklyn, yes? Okay, or we're going to be going, right? Maybe you saw Jimmy Kimmel at the Brooklyn Academy of Music last week. Maybe you're going to take that L train to Williamsburg or Bushwick later, right? The L train runs every once in a while. Well, this is Brooklyn. It's terror in Brooklyn. It's 1941. Luis Guglielmi's work is just perfect for this gallery called Rose Castle because this was the sense of mood and emotion that some of the works can be tied with a theme called surrealism. What does our mind do to us and the artist? What visions do we have? What dreams do we have? How does it show in our visions when we pour it on the canvas? What are the projections, our anxieties? And surrealism often talks about not just dreams, but psychosexual feelings as well. In doing this work of art, Guglielmi did this work a few months before the attack on Pearl Harbor at the end of 1941. This is based upon the thoughts of reality in all of the United States. On the East Coast of the United States, citizens of cities like New York, Philadelphia, Boston, Miami were afraid that U-boats would be coming from Germany across the Atlantic and attacking the East Coast. On the West Coast, there was the fear of planes and others coming across the Pacific from Asia and going towards California, Oregon, and Washington. So there was a real anxiety. That's not the case. Who do we see over here? Three women that are dressed in black. They are either mourning or they are nuns. But they're trapped. They're in a bell jar. They can't get out. With fear on their eyes and faces, they're grabbing onto each other. They see the shadows coming all around them. They don't know what's coming next. What's near them? A black car, likely a hearse. And other cars are continuing back into the depths of the work. What's nearby? Well, pelvic bone nailed to the wall with streamers on. So the question is, how did that get there? In his emotions of showing what maybe had happened or would happen, he has this bone nailed to the wall, blood prints all around it. We see in the sky streamers, maybe it's planes that have come or will be coming, and then there's the anxiety of the street. Look at the strong use of shadows, and shadows of the buildings over here, because we have a real estate office in orange on the corner. Next to it we have kind of this gray building, or a yellow building, another orange building. Across the street with us, there's that building again. Go another block up, again and again. It's repetition. It's in his mind. It's something that these individuals are trapped and can't get out of. Those black cars repeating again and again. So I'm not here to get you upset. I'm here to talk about the art and how was the American thought of anxiety pre-World War II. But anxiety continued into the 1950s in the subway.
White Avenue.
Now, not the people, but the location may look familiar. Some of you maybe today or recently took that A, C, or E line on 8th Avenue, or the B, D, F, or M lines on 6th Avenue. That M line runs every once in a while, right? And this area above the platform with the trains still looks like this. Go around Herald Square on 34th Street or around the Penn Station stations on 6th or 8th Avenue, and you will see it somewhat looks like this. This is called the subway. The work is from 1950. The artist is George Tucker. And when he did this work, he was representing not only a very odd, anxious time in America, but he was also representing something he became known for, pretty much starting from this work and moving forward. His works portrayed not just anxiety, but feelings towards bureaucracy, that we're not anything more than a number, that the government is giving you a certain maybe period of time and then you have to wait. Well, here it's a waiting of what's coming next. In doing this in 1950, the emotion of the work is that this work, he took a big risk, and so did this museum acquiring the work when it was completed in 1950. 3 years before this work was done, at a time of abstraction and American abstraction, the works were not true figuration, not true stories. This is true idea and anxiety and story of the 1950s. 3 years before this, the House of Representatives, they had hearings where they called artists, actors, writers, poets,
Communist.
and they asked, are you a member of the Communist Party? Or do you know somebody? Or do you wish to say who is a member or accused of being a communist? So this was a time over here that he took great risk in doing this work, and we see these individuals that are almost watching each other, following each other. They're in alcoves. She is the central focus and character, which is totally out of line, because 65 years ago, doing this work of art in the mid-20th century, you would very rarely have ever see that the central focus is a woman. And she has a hand on her stomach because she doesn't know who's looking, who's following. Here is a man in his fedora, his hat, he's carrying a briefcase. He's right behind her. Another man over here. These people look trapped. It's not the West 18th Street station on the one line. And over here, these individuals are in their little corners. What that is called is phone booths.
Right.
What's a phone booth? What's a phone booth? Okay, no Verizon at that time. This man in the brown coat over here, Tucker said specifically about this work and this man. He is on the phone and he's calling the FBI. So we knew the connection between the House on Un-American Activities, and those hearings continued to about 1961 about accusations of allegiance to America or not. Other things that we'll mention briefly and lastly about this work before we move on, that hand. That hand looks masculine. It's almost like the hand of a man is grabbing onto her and controlling and telling her what she should do and where she should go. It's very strong masculine in look. And the dress is what color?
Red.
Red. When you were accused of being a communist, you were called at the time in the 1940s and 50s a red. And if you were maybe a communist, you were called pink or pinko. So the difficult time of what he's showing here, the thoughts, what's in our mind, can also be a connection to America in the 1930s with Edward Hopper.
What's interesting is how many people are painted in brown.
Oh, yes. On purpose. Don't leave. We want you here. And you got cool orange over there for your audio guides. You're ready for Halloween. Early Sunday Morning from Edward Hopper is one of the most, if not the most iconic works, not just from Hopper, but about art and American art. He did this work in 1930 and just completed it a few months after the stock market crash in 1929. So this was an odd, difficult time for America, but it fits the mood of America at that time. Maybe about half the population out of work, especially in cities, but also how he is portraying this scene over here. When one looks at this work early Sunday morning, we may think it's tomorrow morning, it's the start of the marathon, it's a nice bright blue sky. Except there's a lot more going on here. This was not the original title of this work. This was called 7th Avenue Shops. He and his wife Jo Nivison, who is an artist, and they got their art career started with Mrs. Whitney at the Whitney Studio Club on 8th Street, by the way. Well, we say there's no people or no individuals here, but that actually is probably incorrect. There are 10 windows here. Are those curtains and shades all the same?
No.
They're different because it's possibly that there are real lives here, living in small rooms, in tough locations, multiple families, at a terrible time economically in America. The mood is shown so strongly in Hopper's works here, especially at the time because of his use of shadow and light. Sometimes those are the real characters. So the name was 7th Avenue Shops, but he and his wife decided that they must change the name because 7th Avenue Shops was too specific. Hopper often paints in what's known as universals. This could be any Main Street, any Broadway, in America, in Montreal, in Lima, Peru. It could be anywhere. But here we look on the windows. Can we make out what it says on those windows? We don't. Because again, it's the sense of mood and direction. He doesn't want it to be so specific. Some looked at this work and studied it, including one of the historical societies, I think in Greenwich Village in the late 1980s, and they said that we can figure out where this work was based upon. And they actually said this work, this is what they said, was around 283 Bleecker Street. Very good cannolis there, but this is not 283 Bleecker Street. Our curators for this work in an exhibit a couple of years ago checked directly. They found photographs of these buildings. It is 88 7th Avenue South between West 15th Street and West 16th Street. The building's not there anymore. However, it's based upon that actual building that had 9 windows instead of 10 and additional storefronts. So he changed the name, changed the title, but then we get the sense and mood at that time in America that was very solemn, very sad. We look at the blue sky over here that many of the color block and color field painters in the 1950s, including Rothko, said that's color field and color block painting about 2 decades before it became important in American art. But look on the far right, brown or black cube stops us. What is that? Hopper was known to not really appreciate changes in the neighborhood because he did this work a few blocks from here. 3 Washington Square North. The building is still there. It has a plaque in front of it, the home of Edward Hopper. He came to New York when he was 18 years old in 1900. He moved into this brownstone around 1913, 1915, and he and his wife lived there until he passed in 1967. He did this work over there. But what was that brown cube about? He was asked in an interview in the 1950s, he and his wife, what is this? What it's about? Well, he was then further asked, without giving too much information, what do you prefer in 2 words about your works of art? Here was his 2-word answer: the past. That represents changing New York, changing urban centers, and what was being built around him in Greenwich Village, 2 18-story apartment buildings, and it was going to change the view and direction he didn't like it. When he was starting to make funds in the 1930s, he bought a plot of land in Truro on Cape Cod and built a home. Now it's enjoying the art and enjoying your visit. Love that Halloween hat. I love your hat. Cool. I think we're all about here. Again, my apologies, we'll run over a few minutes because I want to make sure that everybody comes to join us. We mentioned about Cape Cod a minute ago in talking about Hopper. This is Cape Cod. This is Martha's Vineyard. This artist is Thomas Hart Benton, the same gentleman that painted Poker Night that some of you were here at the start of our tour. But he was more known for works like this. This is 1926, 1927. The work is called The Lord is My Shepherd. These are his neighbors. For over 50 years, he owned a small little cottage or home on Cape Cod and went there pretty much every summer for about 50 years. His neighbors were George and Sabrina West. This area is called Breaking the Prairie, the name of this gallery, because Mrs. Whitney felt that art should not solely feature city and urban centers. It should be the heartland. It should be the hardworking people who use their hands, who are struggling at a certain time of change in America as part of our collection. So when we look at these individuals, this is not somewhere in Kansas or Iowa. This is in Massachusetts. These are his neighbors, George and Sabrina West. We look at them. We look at their faces. We look at their hands. They are hardworking people. They're knurled, and they are so boned and tied up because they're almost arthritic from working the land, working so hard. We look at the shape of their fingers and their hands, and it almost directly curves and changes the direction of how we view the utensils. They can't afford sugar. The utensils are in the bowl. They're having a simple meal. But we know a lot more about George and Sabrina West as what the artist was thinking. And it's very much tied into the theory and thought of this work. Because George and Sabrina West were part of a very interesting community called Chilmark. For over 300 years, Chilmark was such a tiny little town. There was extensive intermarriage between family members. So much so that by the 1920s, it was known that more than 40% of the population was profoundly deaf. George and Sabrina West are deaf. We look at Sabrina's eyes, and she's likely looking towards George's throat to see when his Adam's apple, when he may speak, because she was known to read lips. But we see of this simple meal of sitting down and how George is looking off to the left. Sabrina is staring at George's throat over here. The title, "The Lord is my Shepherd," appears in the work. Where? On the right, above George's head. But look at the reading of this, how respectfully Benton shows the title. They are deaf. What does it say? The Lord is heard. He is showing respect for his neighbors, for people who are hearing impaired, and he wants us to focus on the importance and understanding of individuals who about 80 years ago, those with disabilities weren't even really considered or thought of. Benton was doing it at the time. When we think of the heartland and changing America, where did Georgia O'Keeffe go when she moved from New York City?
Mexico. In one of those buildings.
On in. We're on the last couple of works. Georgia O'Keeffe had a contract to do some of the works for Radio City Music Hall. Amazing. Radio City was being completed around 1929 on the Avenue of the Americas, 6th Avenue, around 48th to 50th Street, as it stands now and so beautiful. She was going to do works of art for them. She accepted the work. She accepted likely some money. She signed the contract. However, the management of Radio City Music Hall wanted the art in a certain way. Some of the research shows that they more wanted it with the stylized themes of the time of New York, which was called Art Deco. She did not feel that way at the time. It was such a difficult time for O'Keeffe because her career was moving forward, but slowly. But it was moving forward because her husband, Alfred Stieglitz, that we mentioned earlier, was really promoting her, so much so. But in the tabloids in New York, sorry, there was no TMZ at that time and no Facebook, all right? It was shown that Stieglitz, in fact, was stepping out, probably seeing other women. Stieglitz was rather upset and depressed at the time. She broke off the contract with Radio City Music Hall, and for the first time in 1929, she went extensive months to here, New Mexico. This is Summer Days from 1936. This speaks so much of the change in her life, time, art, and direction, because she felt really that America was really something that should be focused on the heartland and on abstraction. So much so that she went in 1930 again for more months of time. She went virtually every year until 1949 and moved there permanently until her death in the mid-1980s. She never came back to New York. She did travel, including to Lima, Peru in the 1970s or so. But she also wanted us to focus on what was important to her heart and soul. In Summer Days in 1936, this is her love for animals, growth, mountains, abstraction, and American change, and then the heartland. Because in New Mexico, she gives us this focus of here, the skull of this animal. Look how centered it is. It's almost moving right towards us. It's talking towards us. I paraphrase in a quote that she says about this and similar works. She said, I can bend down. I can hold the bones of animals. I can pick them. I can bring them close to me. They bring so much to my heart and soul. This is what she felt about this and the direction. Over here we see the flowers underneath it. The perspective is different, but it's possibly a sense that some of you viewers, including yourself, may see it's also her identification of life and death, or the afterlife. Below it, on the base, those are the Jemez Mountains in New Mexico, for those of you who've been there. And it does look like this. The clouds up above this. This was her love and consideration. When we talk about this gallery and the heartland and breaking the prairie, we also look at one last work, and it's from Edward Hopper.
Wow.
His room right here. We're waiting for you.
Toy is in there.
Ah, come on in. Come on in. Come on in. Oh, good. On our last work, and again, my apologies, we're running over a little bit because we started a little later and I wanted to give a chance for our guests to move from gallery to gallery. So my apologies. This gallery over here, Breaking the Prairie, is also very much focused on this work, Railroad Sunset from 1929. When Hopper did this work, he completed it just a few months before the stock market crash in 1929. But Hopper was truly known as a foundation idea for this work as a road tripper. He really was. He would go out with his wife, Jo, who was not only his spouse, but his partner, his muse, pretty much solely his model. And she was the one that had all the direction in helping him in terms of his art and business. Because so much so that when they went out often traveling, here by railroad, often in their car, he would be in the car at night, turn on the dome light in their car, and he would sketch, he would draw, he would go back to his home on Truro, on Cape Cod especially, and complete those works of art sometimes many months or a year later. And in doing this work, he was on training. And here, when we give the sense of motion and movement and also mystery, it's nighttime, where the work is physically located by our curators over here. It is in fact in a location that when it is sunset, and sometimes when those shades are open and the sun is going down at 7 p.m., you get the sense of beauty of railroad sunset and sunset on the Hudson. Look at the railroad tracks over here. It's almost in waves. It gives us emotion. It gives us movement. And it's parallel over here to the horizon with over here the sunset that's just occurring. A couple last thoughts with this and Edward Hopper. Hopper's first one-person show was at the Whitney Studio Club on 8th Street, right over here, right a few blocks away. Mrs. Whitney featured him, so much so that there have been more than 50 different exhibits of Edward Hopper tied to the Whitney Museum for the 101 years since Mrs. Whitney started the Whitney Studio Club on 8th Street. Hopper and his wife had an agreement. 2 years after they would pass away, there would be a bequeath, a gift to the Whitney Museum of all his remaining works of art, order books, sketchbooks, all the drawings. So much so that, bless you, when Hopper passed away in 67 and his wife Audley passed away in 68, the bequeath came forward. The Whitney Museum owns more than 2,600 works from Edward Hopper, sketches, drawings, paintings, order books. It's all part of our collection. So I want to leave you with a quote from Steve Martin. Steve Martin is an artist, a writer, a comedian, now a curator out in California. He is somebody who is so knowledgeable about Edward Hopper and collects Hopper's works. He said in a documentary a few years ago, when we look at Hopper's works and it becomes so spare and so emotionally close to us, who's left? You, the viewer. And what does he say and others say about it? We are the silent witnesses. Thank you for coming to the Whitney Museum.
This side. Voy a hacer este examen.